Thank you. So, we think the brain is a private place. And when we're sitting with our bosses or our spouses or our best friends, we're very grateful sometimes that it is. And yet, science, advances in science, is making that less and less true all the time. Today we explore amazing research with scientists who are at least at the beginning stages of being able to decode what's going on in our brains, what we're thinking, identifying objects we're looking at, or even just imagining. Also, we'll look at related research, decoding brain patterns, and using brain-machine interfaces that are being put to use in the field of motor robotics, helping paralyzed patients, locked-in patients, move artificial limbs, communicate, perform many other functions. And to bring us that discussion, let me introduce our panelists. First, John Dylan Haynes, PhD, Bernstein Center in Berlin. John Dylan is a professor of the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience. His major focus is on decoding mental states from human brain activity using pattern recognition. Frank Tong. He studies the neural bases of visual perception. He's a PhD, Vanderbilt University, Associate Professor of Psychology, Cognition, and Cognitive Neuroscience. He studies attention, awareness, recognition, working memory, and he's especially interested in problems of brain reading and mind reading, that is, whether measures of a person's brain activity can be used to read a person's visual thoughts. John Donohue, PhD, Professor Brown University. He's a neuroscientist and founding chair of the Department of Neuroscience there. His research includes revolutionary advances in mind-controlled motor prosthesis, that's moving those artificial limbs, and restoring movement to the paralyzed. And Paul Root-Wolpe, PhD and professor at Emory University. He's the director of the Center for Ethics there. His expertise and research interests are in the area, the very new area, the area that he created of neuroethics. So, let's begin. John Dylan, can you tell us what the headlines are right now in your research?
So in our research field over the last couple of years, it has emerged that you can use brain scanners to decode what a person is thinking with more and more detail. So a couple of years ago, this wouldn't have been thought possible. And now we can't just decode simple visual images, but we can also decode high-level thoughts, such as, for example, plans, action plans, memories, emotions, and things like that. And that's, I think, quite an exciting prospect.
It sounds like you're talking about mind reading.
Well, you could call it mind reading, although the reading might not be quite true, because that would imply that we actually understand the language of the brain. So what we're doing is we're kind of using brute force statistical techniques to kind of decipher what a person is thinking, but we can't actually read the meaning of each individual aspect of brain activity. So we don't understand the actual syntax and semantics of the neural activity.
Can you show us how this works?
I could, if I could see some slides, then I could.
Let's see that first slide. There.
So what you can see here on the left is just the mind reading of the 1900s. So in those days, people were very fascinated by the idea of kind of stage tricks, stage magic. And what you can see here is a typical stage demonstration. And a person comes out of the audience, comes up on the stage, and this person with their mind reading abilities is able to draw a figure that this person is thinking of. And on the right, what you can see here is our current version. You can see a brain scanner. And this brain scanner now, we could possibly read out what this person is thinking of. Even though they might not tell us what they're thinking of, we might be able to still read out this information if we can decipher their brain activity properly.
Well, how are our conscious thoughts encoded?
Well, I'll show you just a brief example.
One more, the next slide, please.
So this is the brain scanner, just to inform you what a brain scanner is. It's ultimately a very strong magnet. It's like a coil magnet, just that it has a much stronger magnetic field than the Earth's magnetic field. And if we could show the next slide, I don't know if I can forward it with this. It seems I can't. Oh. So what you can see here on the left is the typical patterns of brain activity you get when people have different thoughts. Say, for example, thinking about a face, a house, and so on. And the meaning of your thoughts is encoded in these patterns of brain activity. And then what you have to do is you have to somehow analyze this, and for that you can use something similar to what you know from CSI. So if you just could show the next animation, just click once. We apply similar statistical techniques that we would normally use to decipher fingerprints, and we train a pattern classifier to recognize these patterns of brain activity, and with that we can then find these individual thoughts. It's very similar to the idea of actually using a fingerprint to recognize an individual. You have a big database of fingerprints, and you've got names associated with them. And similar here, we take the spatial patterns of brain activity, and we can identify specific thoughts that a person has, as long as they're in this database. So when you then, if you could just show the next one, you measure a pattern of brain activity and you don't know what this person is thinking, then your pattern classifier just guesses that this is most likely going to be the one that is most similar, so statistically optimal techniques are used for this, and then you would, in this case, for example, guess that the person is thinking about, well, you could possibly guess it in the audience. The person is thinking, does anyone have an idea? Exactly, so if you could resolve it, you'll see, just press once more.
One more slide?
Yeah, you can see it was actually a chair.
Well, let me ask you then. Let me try and decode what you've decoded here. I see a fingerprint. That means that these patterns, the way that this individual identifies a face, a house, a chair, a shoe, are unique to that individual? Or do we see that kind of, can we extrapolate that lit up pattern to other people?
That's a very, very interesting question. Actually, I think the field hasn't quite gotten to answering this question. At a very coarse level, of course, if the pattern of brain activity, if different people see faces, is very similar to houses. But as soon as you get into the subtle details of a person's thoughts, say, for example, you want to know which house, which face, which chair, which shoe, or other subtle aspects, then it seems that these fine-grained details are encoded quite differently from person to person. And the reason is that, of course, they're mixed with your individual experiences, with your history that you have, your emotional connotations, the thoughts that you kind of associate with specific objects and images. And that's why these are encoded differently in each person. But
So far we can only really know how that person feels about a face.
I think it's not completely true. So you can guess to a certain degree from a group of people how you could decode the patterns of brain activity from another person. But as soon as you get into the finer details, then you kind of lose this information.
What about intentions, conscious thoughts? I mean, if we get beyond the issue of objects, how deeply can you probe using this kind of fMRI technology?
Well, behind the stage, of course, we had a brain scanner installed that you didn't know of, so we were able to predict that you're going to ask this question. And if you just press the next slide. So this is exactly a line of research we've been looking at. So in this case, a person was put in a scanner. It's just not shown in a scanner here for ease. And they were asked to, at some point, that they could freely choose to press either a left or right button. So this is a very simple intention. It's not an intention like, am I going to go to New York or Washington? But it's an intention that is kind of crystallizes this idea. You can use your free will at this point in time to decide either for left or right. And the question was, would we be able to read out this person's intention? And would we be able to read it out even before they themselves know how they're going to decide? And so that we could know when they made up their mind, we had a letter on a screen that changed every half second. So they had to remember, when they make up their mind, they have to remember which letter was on the screen, and it just tells us, it's like a tag that tells us when they've made up their mind. And then if you show...
Hold up just a second here, John Dillon, because I'm not sure that I'm following you. You're saying that you can predict how somebody is going to behave by studying how they make decisions over time, a particular decision.
Yeah.
And how does the letter on the screen figure into that?
The letter figures in, so basically, it's very simple. You're there, you're relaxing, and at some point when you feel the urge to do so, you make a spontaneous decision for left or right. And we just want to know when you made up your mind. So the letter doesn't really have any importance. It could just as well use a clock. And you just ask people, when did you make up your mind? Where was the clock when you made up your mind? And you say, for example, at 10 o'clock. And then we know, okay, this is when they made up their mind, this is when they pressed the button, and then we want to go back in time from the point when they made up their mind and see how early we can predict how they're going to decide, even before they themselves know how they're going to decide. And if you bring up the next point, you will see that this is a pattern of brain activity. So what you can see here, these are regions of the brain that are involved in very high-level mental activity, for example, planning your actions and reflecting about yourself. And below that, you can see like a geometric pattern of brain activity. And this geometric pattern of brain activity can tell us how someone is going to decide before they themselves even know what they're going to do. So we find that parts of the brain here, they have patterns of brain activity that emerge that predict your decision even before you yourself know how you're going to decide. They give your decision away before you know.
But the degree of decision, did I just get, there I am. But the degree of decision we're talking about, the importance of the decision, has to do with a simple act, right? I mean, does this technology enable you to predict decisions of a more important nature at this point?
Well, I think the difficulty is not so much predicting decisions of a more important nature. Say, for example, am I going to choose one college or the other or something like that, really important lifetime decisions. The difficulty is to get the computer to train on these decisions. So we have to learn what the patterns of brain activity are that emerge, that give a person's decisions away. And of course, a lifetime decision can only be done once. You can't get a person to choose once which college they're going to take, and then 5 minutes later ask them, please choose again which college you're going to take. And then 5 minutes later, you ask them again, please choose again.
There are plenty of people who've had exactly that experience.
Well, they can sign up as volunteers. Yeah.
Then let me just ask you, what ultimately do you see as the value of this research?
Well, I think the value of this research is that it shows that you can decode not just simple visual aspects of visual information processing, I'm sure Frank is going to talk about, but we can also get at something that's more closely related to kind of behaviorally important information. Of course, now one of the next things we're going to look into is how you could decode something more closely related to day-to-day behavior. For example, say your plan to go to the post office before you go home or something like that. So if we can read out these more everyday intentions, that will be fantastic. And I think this helps us pinpoint the brain areas where we can find this information.
We're going to be discussing the ethics of all of this later, but I just want to plant a little bit of a seed here. Does this technology ultimately lead to the kind of privacy invasions that people are worried about? Can you build a better lie detector that way? Can you find out what that person hates? Let's say if they have a racial issue or something like that. Will that be evident in the scans that you do? I mean, can you get down to that level, things of consequence that people might not want others to know?
I think one issue is what can we do now and what are we going to be able to do in the future? And I think at the moment we can't do too much. I mean, this is still very basic research. But I think what the basic research shows is that it's feasible to decode things that you would have never considered possible. And that now you might find that the applications side of this is going to be much easier than we would have thought a couple of years ago, because a lot of these applications, you don't need to read out like very fine-grained details of a person's thoughts. Say, if you want to build a lie detector, you just want to know deception, yes, no. Or if you want to build a neuromarketing device that asks, can we predict a purchase decision from the brain? You want to know, are they going to buy the car, yes or no? So a lot of these simple applications are feasible from this. I think we're still going to take still going to take us a couple of years to develop applications like these. And of course, we also have to ask the question if we want to develop these applications.
Well, before we move on to Frank, can you tell us what it is that the fMRI measures? And we all know that an MRI, a conventional MRI, measures the structure of your brain, if there are any abnormalities, if there are any lesions, an MRI could see that. But yours measures something else.
Well, to a rough approximation, what we measure is the change in the oxygenation level of the blood. So when neurons fire, they need oxygen. And this oxygen gets taken out of the blood, and then the brain replenishes the oxygen, and then this changes the magnetic properties of the blood. And this is something we can pick up with a scanner. So it's a rather indirect measure of neural activity. We can't actually get to individual neurons. The information we pick up is kind of coarse. We have a resolution of 3 millimeters, roughly. And of course, we don't get down.
It's an after effect of brain function.
It's an after effect, but still, it's closely correlated with brain activity. But of course, we'd be able to get at much more information if we were able to record the activity of single neurons. But this is not possible. The techniques that we and that Frank uses are restricted to non-invasive techniques where we don't open the skull, we can't implant electrodes in the brain. Of course, we don't want to do that. So we're always limited.
We don't know that you don't want to do that.
Well, I tell you.
Let me move on to Frank now. Frank, I know your work is very much in parallel with John Dillon's, except that yours seem to be at work decoding visual images, images that people take in and store in their brain, and even images that they can imagine?
That's right. So we know a great deal about the visual system, but from both animal studies and human studies. So it's a great test bed to look at just how much information can we squeeze out from the brain using these non-invasive methods, and how detailed of a picture can we get of what people are either seeing, paying attention to, or even imagining. And so that's what my lab's pushing towards, to try to understand how visual thoughts are represented in the brain. And in one of our early studies, if I can go to my first slide, let's go back. What we did here was we tried to figure out whether we could read out what orientations a person's seeing. And I'll quickly describe two important properties of the human visual system.
Orientation. You mean the position that they're in? Or?
I'll explain that. Mm-hmm. So imagine, sorry, I seem to have a lot of feedback here. Should I move this a little bit? By orientation, I mean, what's represented in the visual brain, imagine if you just kept your eyes fixed, is that the pattern of light that hits your retina is mapped onto the visual cortex in a global core scale map. So this point of light would be represented somewhere, this one somewhere else, this one somewhere else. And on top of that, at a fine scale is a representation of orientation. So at this particular point, let's say if we present a little set of stripes and we just rotated them around, what we'd see is that would activate a tiny little column, maybe just 0.5 millimeter wide, that would swirl around a pinpoint. And so when we measure signals from the human brain, we're measuring with these really large, sort of 3 millimeter chunks, let's say. We can get finer than that. But we can't resolve the representation of orientation in the brain. And one thing that my lab has pushed is, how far can pattern recognition take us to read out a signal that we might think would otherwise be invisible to our methods?
I can only speak for myself, but I think you lost me somewhere along the way, and I wonder if you could just roll back a little bit and explain what orientation is one more time.
So orientation is like what's vertical, what's horizontal, what is a different tilt. It is the most basic feature that's represented in the visual system. It's the way you see the outline of a bottle, the lines of the face. It is the most basic unit by which we represent visual information in the cortex. And if we can understand how to read that out, we can get a lot of information potentially out from the brain. So what pattern recognition can do, I was just at MoMA today and I was looking at some Jackson Pollock paintings. So if you have an array of different colors represent neurons that like different orientations, in any given patch, maybe you have just slightly more black than white paint. In the patch next to it, more a different proportion. By applying pattern recognition, we can read out what orientation a person's seeing with, let's say, 95% accuracy, really high accuracy for which of two orientations a person's seeing.
Are you looking at the same sorts of pictures that John Dillon looks at? These are pictures of, oxygenation of cells.
That's right.
And you're identifying the same sorts of patterns that his subjects that emerged when his subjects looked at shoes and houses and faces and so forth.
It's an earlier part of the brain that represents this more basic information. But let me step forward. So it's interesting that we can read out the orientation, which only exists at a fine scale, even though we're measuring these coarse scale patterns. But what we wanted to next test is, I call that an example of brain reading. We're just reading out what the person's seeing. That's kind of cool, but I could also just look over the person's shoulder and say, oh, they're looking at this pattern rather than that pattern.
So you know how their brain lights up when they look at a cat?
Exactly. And decoding a cat from a dog from visual cortex could be easier to do than this angle of lines versus this angle. So it's a hard test case. What we'd like to know is whether we can read out what a person's paying attention to. This is an example of reading out something about mental thought, intention. So in this case, if we ask people to pay attention to the white set of lines or the black set of lines, we can read out what orientation they're paying attention to with high accuracy, not just what they're seeing, suggesting that we can read out something about the person's attentional state or what is it they're focusing on. Other groups have further focused on what it is, how far can we push this technique if we make use of the fact that these different global patterns on the retina lead to different activations in the visual cortex. So in this study, it gets a little complicated, but essentially every little spot in your visual cortex responds to a different part of the visual field. And if you present, let's say, 1,000 or 2,000 different pictures, just say random pictures selected from Google, each of those will create a unique pattern of activity in your brain. And what this group showed was that they could, based on these activation patterns, predict novel pictures that the person saw. So at test, they showed 120 different pictures, and they could correctly predict which picture the subject was seeing 110 times. So with a really, really high accuracy. And what you see in the sort of scatter plot there, where there's that sharp red along the diagonal, is their ability to predict the correct image. So along the one axis would be the image that they saw, and along the other axis is the predicted image. And the fact that everything falls on that diagonal means that they're getting it right most of the time.
Can I ask you about imaginary images that emerge from the imagination? You can read those and you can interpret those based on how their brain lights up in an fMRI?
Yeah,
So do you know, can you tell if somebody is imagining a cat?
we can,
And can
actually.
you tell if that cat is leaning to the left or leaning to the right with regard to orientation?
I think if we focus on that, we could do that. I'll take you through, again, the cat's a little bit easier. I know it sounds less realistic, but it's a little easier.
I'm just trying to make it easy for me, not
Sure.
for you.
Gotcha,
But
gotcha.
you can come up
Gotcha.
with anything else.
Sure. So in this study that we did, what we were trying to read out was what people were holding in memory. And essentially, the way they held it in memory is that they had to keep imagining this pattern. So we present one of two visual patterns, and then we say, remember the first one or remember the second one. And we could read out from a person's brain activity which of the two patterns they were holding in memory over time. This was work done with Stephanie Harrison, from the fact that they kept thinking about that pattern. If they stopped thinking about it, that signal went away. And what was interesting about this study was that we revealed information using these decoding methods that was never seen before. So before it was thought that the visual cortex is silent. It seems pretty quiet, and it goes silent when you're looking at a blank screen just thinking about something you see visually. What we found is that if we measure the overall level of brain activity, the amount of blood flow going to the visual cortex, it fell back to the level of what you would see if a person was looking at a blank screen. But if we look at the detailed pattern, what we saw was a lot of information. We could read out what the person was holding in memory with high accuracy.
So tell me what this picture actually says. You see, I'm assuming that the yellow and blue dots are the readout. Is that correct? They seem to be quite different, and yet you could identify that this person was remembering this pink object, I'm not sure what it is, and holding it in her memory, and even with that, I guess it's 18% variation in the readout of the brain. You said 83% accuracy, 17%.
That's right. So this is a schematic, but what the yellow and blue patterns show are the different chunks of the brain that are voting essentially for one pattern or another, respond more to one pattern or another, and when they're imagining one pattern or another, their activity is biased. And so it's not exactly the same remembering and seeing, but it's similar enough that we can predict with pretty good accuracy what the person is holding on into memory. And the interesting thing is that the level of activity we see in the brain, the overall level, is lower than what you'd see if you ever looked at anything, even the faintest possible image. And yet that information is still there. So it suggests that thinking about something or imagining something is kind of like seeing it, but at such low levels of activity that you'd never confuse it for actual immediate perception. It's a faint echo of actually seeing the real thing, in a sense.
Any chance that you'll ever be able to visually decode dreams?
Perhaps. A colleague of mine in the previous study is working on an interesting problem, which is trying to reconstruct what people are seeing. And it hasn't been done yet, but the natural question one would ask next is, could we ever reconstruct what a person is imagining? I'll give you a flavor of his study. What he did was he would show different flickering patches of light in a 10 by 10 grid, and sometimes it was just different random patterns. Sometimes they were on or off. And you know the story, a picture's worth 1,000 words. It's actually worth much more than 1,000 words with just a simple 10 by 10 grid. And trust me, you wouldn't pay money to have 10 by 10 resolution on your iPhone or something like that. But with just a 10 by 10 grid, how many possible images can you make? You can make 2 to the power of 100 images if we're just saying it's on or off. So that's a big number. I don't know what that is off the top of my head, but 2 to 100 is a big number. If you can see what he's done, he's trained on a bunch of random noise patterns, and he can spell out, later when he shows recognizable images, he can spell out from a person's brain activity what the person saw. So you can see the word neuron being reconstructed from a person's brain activity, sort of a square of different sizes, a plus sign, an X. And in essence, what he's doing here is reconstructing what the person saw. I call this, again, a fancy example of brain reading. It's kind of cool, but we don't need a $3 million machine to do what you could do simply looking over the person's shoulder and see what they saw. But the next step might be, could you reconstruct what a person's imagining? So I'll just give a sample sort of sci-fi thought case. Imagine you were an eyewitness to a crime, and you saw the suspect, but unfortunately you're a lousy artist. You can't really draw what you saw. Would it be one day possible that the person is imagining what they saw, and you could reproduce, with reasonable likeness, what the person saw? That would be pretty handy, because, as we said, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and we have a very hard time translating what we've seen into any reconstructed form that another person could experience.
So this is about thought identification. In both of your cases, it's about thought identification, but it's still more or less limited to the individual. You figure out how that individual's brain lights up, and then you can identify how what they might be thinking on the basis of how those scans light up. This would be a good time, I think, to show a clip of what was done at Carnegie Mellon by Tom Mitchell and Marcel Juste. And this is also about thought identification. Let's watch it, and then I'd like you guys to relate this experience to your own work.
What we're doing is trying to tie the biology of the brain, the neural activity, to the ideas that we're thinking about.
So Justin is now being shown these word-image pairs. There are a total of 8 distinct ones, and each one is going to be shown 3 times. And that'll be the data that we'll be using. And the only information it'll have to go on is the brain image. So from his brain image for these new words, it'll have to identify which one it is.
Now that we've collected the images from Justin's brain while he was thinking about these 8 words, we've asked the computer algorithm to look at the brain imaging data that we've collected and tell us which word was which.
The word was chisel.
My first guess is chisel.
So it got chisel on the first guess.
So in the next experiment, what we're doing is we're going to take a classifier that was not trained using data from Justin. Instead, it was trained using data from other people. And we're going to determine whether that classifier, which has never seen data from Justin's brain before, can successfully determine which word that he's looking at.
So the first word, we've asked it to say, was the word eye or was it closet?
I think the word is eye.
Okay, so it was correct.
It got it. It says based entirely on other people's brain activation.
I think the word is apartment.
I
That's
think that's
10.
it. Got on 10 out of 10 in a two-choice test. It got a perfect score. Now, what this shows is that other people represented these 10 items rather similarly to the way that Justin did. It means that all of us, to some extent, when we think of a chair or an apple or a hammer or any physical object, very similar things are happening to our brain.
So it sounds like your work is more extrapolatable than you might have thought, or that I might have thought. Is this the direction that you guys have been moving in all along?
I think that the difference between the cases that Frank and I are looking into in this case is that we're more interested in subtly different thoughts. So a closet versus an eye, very different thoughts, lots of different associations. And first of all, these very different cases are easier to read out. The more similar the patterns of brain activity get, the more difficult it is to read out the information. And also, if you, as I said earlier on, if you get into these very subtle, fine-grained details, then this kind of similarity between people breaks down. So then the idiosyncrasies, the differences of associations, the wiring, fine-grained wiring patterns and so on, they play a much bigger role. So I think if you were to try and find out which closet or whose eye and so on the person was thinking about, that would be much more difficult. But of course, this is absolutely fascinating research.
Are some people harder to scan than others? Some people's minds more cluttered when asked to do when asked to make a simple decision so that you can scan them?
Actually, I once had a very interesting radio conversation with someone from Bolivia, and it was the first time someone had ever asked this question to me. He said, he was very bubbly on the phone, and he said, oh yeah, but we have all these different thoughts going on in our mind at the same time, and everything is happening in parallel, and how can we read out all these different things? And I think it's true that these cases would be very difficult, and we don't know how the overlap of different thoughts in the brain would kind of hinder us, stop us, prevent us from decoding the information. But still, of course, what we're looking at are very simple scenarios. So these kind of real-day situations, real everyday, day-to-day situations, the typical ongoing daydreaming thought content of your mind, I think is going to be very difficult to get at in the finest grain detail.
And as you say, you don't want to put electrodes into people's minds. On the other hand, John Donahue does. And as a result, you are actually able to work on the single neuronal level. You can pinpoint single neurons in order to create motor responses. Can you describe your work?
Well, so what we're doing actually is going the other direction. We're trying to take thoughts and turn them into actions. And we're not doing them for the fun of it, but we're actually trying to create devices or applied technologies that can help people who have a brain that works and a body that doesn't. They're not connected to the outside world because they have a spinal cord injury or a stroke or other kinds of degenerative disorders like ALS or multiple sclerosis. So what we're doing is using at the finest scale now, and you'll see in a couple of minutes a description of this, taking at the finest scale neuronal activity, reading out intentions to move, and turning them in or decoding them into, in many cases, a control of a movement of a cursor. So when you think about moving your arm, you'll move a cursor. But we've done other things too, and I think maybe if we start with the video from a 60 Minutes clip. It was a show shown last year in 60 Minutes. This is a very short piece of it, and it'll show, I think, a nice description of the BrainGate system, which is a kind of neural interface or brain-computer interface that we're developing for people with paralysis. And they'll introduce Kathy, who is tetraplegic. That means she can't move her arms and legs due to a stroke in the part of her below her brain but above her spinal cord. So maybe we can have that video first, please.
Kathy Hutchinson is among the first humans to have her brain directly wired to a computer. Years ago, Kathy suffered a stroke that left her mentally sharp but trapped inside a paralyzed body and unable to speak. Kathy volunteered to have the same kind of sensors we saw in the monkeys implanted in her motor cortex, which controls movement and is located right on the surface of the brain. The sensors connect to the computer through this plug on her head. The system is called BrainGate, and it was created by a team led by Brown University neuroscientist John Donahue.
If you look at this square, each one of these little black boxes is the electrical signal coming from one electrode in the brain.
And each one of those is a neuron firing.
Right. It's its electrical potential. It lets out a 1,000th of a second pulse.
We watched together as Kathy showed us what she can do.
There's a handful of icons that have been placed on the screen.
Here's Google, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and here's Mass General Hospital Stroke Service.
Yep.
We're seeing Kathy moving this cursor with nothing but her mind.
That's right. She's thinking about the movement of her hand, and she's moving the cursor much as if she had her hand on a mouse.
So if a patient who's paralyzed thinks, move my left arm, the brain fires those neurons.
Yes.
Even though the arm does not move.
Yes, it's very surprising. So the show goes on, but what I'd like to show, if you could just continue with the next piece, is that in the end, what we said, we can also control real-world devices, not just cursors on a screen. So here's an example of Kathy controlling a wheelchair. Now, we didn't put her in it because we didn't know how she would drive it. She did, in fact, run over my toe and hit the bookcase. But what that shows, that was wirelessly connected from her brain directly to this wheelchair, showing that, in fact, you could use brain power to imagine moving something, and then it would come to reality and be moved.
So anybody who saw the diving bell and the butterfly, right? Or a recent episode of House, locked-in syndrome, it's called. Blinking was one way that was used to communicate. A whole world has opened up for this woman.
Right, and we've shown this in 4 patients, that the ability to use the output of the brain, these neuronal activities, to drive various kinds of things like cursors. If you put up that slide, please, what you can see, there we go. It just shows you the basic system as it stands today. So let me emphasize, it's at a very early stage. 4 people have been studied. We just got permission to study 15 more. But what you can see in this, the red circle on the left there is what's called the BrainGate array, and it looks a little bit big, but it's actually only the size of a baby aspirin, and it has 100 hair-thin electrodes that go just into the surface of your cerebral cortex, which is sort of an orange peel-thick rind on the outside of your cortex, outside of your brain. And that sits in the brain. There's a plug on the head, as you saw in Kathy. This is very primitive. We're working towards making one that's wireless, but it's not there yet. That elicits action potentials, or these spikes, or these electrical impulses you can see in the green oscilloscope trace at the top. And then you can see a cartoon of the wires coming out of the head going into a card of electronics, where all of this magical decoding, where we interpret the impulses coming out of the brain and put it into a computer screen where the computer thinks it's getting a mouse command.
How does this relate to the thought identification that's being done by Frank and John Dillon? Do you now, obviously, you're not looking at a picture of a picture. You're not looking at the result of thoughts. You're actually down there in real time?
Well, these are reflections of thoughts. They're a small sample. There are really millions and millions of cells involved in generating this activity. We're looking at a tiny sample of all of those cells, because these electrodes can only record from a cell that's very, very close to it. So we get a few cells, a few dozen, maybe 100 if we're lucky. From that, though, we can interpret and get quite a bit of control. And I think if we can ask, how far can we go? If you put up the next slide, how much information can you get? Or this next video, please. If you say, how much information can you get out of the brain? Here what you're watching is a monkey playing catch. And that is what's called a motion capture device. All those little dots are special illuminated objects that tell a bunch of cameras where the arm is. We capture that, and we say, okay, that's where the arm is. And at the same time, we have that same array that's in Kathy in the arm area of this motor part of the brain. This is in a monkey now. And we ask the question, how much can we actually decode or read out from that part of the brain? And what you can see here is a reconstruction. The ghosted looking image is what the monkey was actually doing, and the shakier solid color one is what we were decoding from the brain. And what's amazing and actually surprising to us is that we can decode really almost everything that's going on as you reach out and grasp an object. So if a paralyzed person were to have this array in their brain, they could potentially be able to reach out and grasp if we could control their muscles.
With an artificial arm.
Well,
prosthetic
even
arm.
a prosthetic arm, a robotic arm, or perhaps even their own arm. So as we get on in another couple of seconds, we'll move on to a demonstration where we asked simply, Kathy, how well can you control a virtual arm? So here's Kathy. You can see her head in shadow at the side there. And she's looking at a virtual arm. And instead of moving a cursor, she's moving that fingertip around on the screen. And you can see not only can she move the arm around, she can also click by flexing her finger when she imagines squeezing her hand. So she can point and click, basically. Now, what's incredible about this is movement is not occurring simply as a movement of a cursor. That arm is being driven by 6 simulated muscles that behave just like our real muscles do. So she's actually driving muscles that's driving her arm. Well, that's what we do. So someday what we hope is that we could implant wires into the muscles and stimulate the muscles under commands from the brain. So the wires in the muscles already exist. That has been done. There are about several hundred people that have wires in the muscles, but they control it with clicks from the outside. If you have BrainGate, a device like BrainGate, driving the arm, we would actually be able to reanimate muscles and people would be able to move again, people that are paralyzed. So we'd build a physical nervous system where the biological one is broken. So if Kathy had these stimulating wires in her muscles, she could actually move. Not very elegantly, she'd be able to move with support around on a tabletop, perhaps grab a cup of water and bring it over to her mouth and take a sip. But remember now, she can't have a sip of water unless someone brings it to her.
What about, you said you can't, you can recreate the broken biology. What about broken eyes, broken ears?
So remember that. So what I just spoke about was taking information out of the nervous system and trying to produce movement. But what you just spoke of was bringing information into the nervous system. And there are, in fact, a number of cases where that's being tried. The most successful is the cochlear implant, in which a tiny noodle-sized thread is threaded up into the ear, and with electrical stimulation of transduced sound. So sounds are transformed into patterns of electrical stimulation. It goes in and it bypasses the lost parts of the ear and activates the brain. And surprisingly, even with 8 channels of stimulation, you can replace 30,000 channels of the normal brain. So there are about 100,000 people with cochlear implants. With the eye, the earliest stages of testing are now happening. There are about 6 patients have a very, very crude sense of light and dark produced by retinal implants that stimulate the back of their eye that sends information up to the brain. So we're seeing, this is all called neurotechnology, and really we're at the beginning of this age where replacement parts for a broken body can be derived from physical components. So this is really a consequence of understanding this code between the brain and the outside world, or the inside of the brain and the outside world.
So when you look at Geordie's glasses in the next generation, do you see a real future there?
Well, his glasses, I think, transduce something into his eyes.
But they are actually, I think they're sending impulses into his brain. Yeah.
Yeah. So in fact, there are several people who already have devices like that, and that they have a camera on the outside, a little chip in their eye, and that is giving them signals. But they're not seeing a stage like this with color and form and motion. What they can see is if there was a large black wall with a white door, they could tell that there was a white door there, sort of. And they're harnessing all the rest of their brain power to do that.
Okay, so we've now seen a number of ways, and potentially an infinite number of ways that we can have the privacy of our skulls violated for good, or perhaps not for good. And that's why I want to bring you in, because you've created this field of neuroethics, because you can clearly see that there are ethical issues that will have to be resolved before we can apply the science that is now being developed.
Right. Well, I didn't create it single-handedly. It was a group of us. But for each of the kinds of different neurotechnologies we've heard, there are different kinds of issues that come up. So if we start with fMRI and imaging the brain, there are some very interesting questions. You brought up the issue of privacy. But before I mention it, I want to say something more fundamental about it. In all of human history, from the time we crawled out of the trees until modern times, without a single exception, ever, anywhere, any information you got from another human being, you got from their peripheral nervous system. Language, expression, heartbeat, sweating, it doesn't matter what it is. You got no information, nor was there any way to ever get any information directly from the brain. About 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that changed. And now, for the first time in human history, we can get information directly from the brain. So one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, what does that mean? How does that matter, if it does matter at all? I think it matters a lot. It changes a lot of things that may not, at the beginning, be obvious. Certainly, there's the issue of privacy. The good news right now for fMRI is you can't coercively make someone go into an fMRI. You have to cooperate, you have to lie still, you have to think about what they want you to think about. But it's not that far in the future in which we might be able to get information through fMRI or, by the way, through some other techniques they're trying to use, like functional near infrared and other kinds of techniques that don't involve a multi-million-dollar big machine, where we might be able to begin to get information from people's brains remotely or covertly even, possibly. Now, that's not now. It's a possibility for the future, but it's there. So the privacy issue is going to be a very, very big issue, and it's going to have implications socially. It's going to have implications legally, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But the other thing I wanted to say about it is there's a tendency a lot of people have to worry about this a lot. And I want to emphasize that many of these technologies will do enormous good and will allow us, if you take John Donahue's people who are quadriplegic, it will allow great therapeutic innovations in terms of understanding the way the brain works. Some of the work has been done to try to understand learning disabilities and other things. So there's real great potential here. And my concern is that we do this in a way that makes sure that as we move along this path, and by the way, I got into this very early. I started reading the literature when it first started coming out, and I kept thinking, we're going to hit a wall. That's as far as we're going to be able to go. And then they made another breakthrough. I said, well, that's as far as we're going to be able to go. I'm telling you, I've stopped predicting that that's as far as we're going to be able to go. Each new paper, each new breakthrough makes me think someday we actually will be able to apprehend very specific thoughts from people's brains.
I want to bring you in just a moment, but I think I want to give you something to react to. So can you talk to me a little bit about what the non-medical applications of this thought identification and brain-machine interface technology might be?
Well, I think there are a number of...
I think you're not mic'd.
Sorry.
Okay. So, for example, thinking that I want my microphone to be turned on and it to be turned on.
It's a miracle.
Now, if I was to go to John Donahue, I'd have the problem that he'd have to drill a hole in my brain, in my skull, and my skull, exactly, and then prong a little electrode grid into my brain. I think that shows that, I mean, they're two different research fields, ultimately, complementary research fields. On the one hand, medical applications, invasive electrodes, let's try and get as much information as we can for the benefit of the patients. On the other hand, what can we do non-invasively with the non-invasive neuroimaging technology that we have, which is, of course, still limited? And the kind of things I think we're going to see are very simple applications that don't need us to kind of read out the full-blown details of a person's thoughts, but something like a person is lying, yes or no, or a person wants to buy a car, yes or no. These kind of applications, I think, are the applications we're going to see. And now, we're not there at the moment. We can't, I mean, there are companies claiming that they can already do this, which is, of course, rather misleading. But I think because these applications are so simple yes-no questions, we might be seeing them in the next 10 or 20 years. And one thing to possibly even kind of an important variable in this is if someone now was to invent a brain imaging device that gets at neural activity at a much finer level, then I think we'd see it even much faster. So these are the kind of applications I think we're going to see. And of course, where we want to think if we want to use them, yes or no. I guess, for example, lie detection, not necessarily here in the USA. In Europe, for example, where I live, I mean, they hate lie detectors. They would never want to invade in a person's mental privacy, which I think is problematic, of course, because you can also assist an innocent person in demonstrating their innocence. So, I mean, it's...
Similarly, I think lie detection is an interesting problem that some people have made overly strong claims about its potency. And as these methods get more powerful, there are two issues that come up. One is, will it ever be accurate enough that we would have confidence that it's doing it correctly? And then the ethical issue of, is that invasion of privacy and notions of the Fifth Amendment? And then also the notion of, could one voluntarily choose to undergo a test, and would that be useful? I was always very much against lie detection and that notion of that technology, and I got a rather poignant letter from a person who was in prison in Georgia. He was 60-something year old, and he said, I was really interested in this article I read about your research and also about lie detection. Is that allowed, and is there any way I could set up a test? I got convicted for a crime that I'm not guilty of. I don't even want to get out of jail. I just want to clear my name. And is there any means for me? And I was struck by it and how personally it was written, that we have a lot of people who go to jail, and the system by which we decide innocence or guilt is noisy. How accurate would such a system have to be before we would consider allowing people to voluntarily take a test? And what would our view of that, in the sense that we're reading out a person's thoughts? Would we want to go there? Is that reading out an example of testimony, or is it evidence? We don't know how to think about these ideas yet.
Paul.
Well, let me give two examples of that. First, the Fifth Amendment. I wrote a paper with a student of mine who's at NYU Law School and told me she'd be somewhere in the audience, Sarah Stoller, in which we looked at the question of the Fifth Amendment. So it's a very interesting thing. The Fifth Amendment is not a law against self-incrimination. It's a law against testimonial self-incrimination. So if I could incriminate myself, or if you could prove that I did something by taking my blood or a hair sample, I have to give that even though it's self-incrimination. What you can't force me to do is testify. And there's a lot of case law about this. So let's imagine for a moment that we're now in a situation where you could brain image me and get a piece of information from my brain that would convict me. Is that testimony? The answer is, it's not testimony, and it's not testimony. It is something brand new that we have not defined. And I guarantee that at some point in the next 10 years, the Supreme Court is going to have to decide whether a piece of information gotten from the brain is testimonial evidence or non-testimonial evidence. A second quick example, you brought up racism, or John Dillon brought up racism. There's an interesting study done, also here in New York at SUNY, by Liz Phelps, looking at people's brains who had taken a paper and pencil test in which was an embedded racism scale. And what she found that there were these white males were put into the scanner, so were black males, but it was the white males that she found an effect. And she flashed pictures of known white males, politicians, sports figures, movie stars, unknown white males, known black males, and unknown black male faces. And what she found was that there was a correlation between how these men did in racist ideation in this hidden scale that they didn't know they had taken, and amygdala activation, and the amygdala is the part of the brain that responds to anxiety and excitation, when they saw, and only when they saw, unfamiliar black male faces. Now, imagine for a minute that we could turn that around, and Liz Phelps hates when you do this because this wasn't part of her study, but imagine if you could put men into a scanner, not having taken that scale, and you could show them pictures and say, aha, his amygdala is reacting when he sees unfamiliar black male faces. This is a man that has some level of racist ideation. Well, some people could see that as an empirical measure of racism. And in certain court cases, the question of hate crimes and degree of racism, and people who actually have tried to use uncontrolled racist rage as an excuse to get away from performing hate crimes, has been very, very much a part of the way in which certain court cases have gone. So there's some very interesting kinds of information and questions that are going to arise as we become better and better at reading the brain.
So there are several legal issues, I know, there, but they're not currently being considered because this technology is not yet available.
Well, we haven't talked about, we've only talked about a very small sample of the kinds of interesting questions that new brain technologies are raising. For example, how do we use a brain image of an offender's brain to suggest that there were mitigating circumstances? This is actually something that has been in a number of court cases and is very current. So I'm a lawyer, I have a client, the client did something terrible, I bring in my brain image of the client's brain, and you say, here's an abnormality in his brain, or here's a tumor. That's why he did it. Courts actually don't know what to do with that information right now. I'm not sure anybody, even the experts, don't know what to do with that information. But as we begin to learn more and more about the brain, people are going to bring those kinds of things in, and they already are, just not the level of things that the sophisticated kind of science that the panel is doing. These things are already beginning to come into courts, and the courts have to grapple with them.
I don't even know if these exist, but the thing that people always bring up as an object of, along these lines is the airport scanner, the one that will be, you know, passed over you to determine whether or not you're a terrorist. There are people who have, who seem to be advertising devices of this nature, and I don't know whether they're real or, you know, whether this is just a joke or what the state of these things are, but could you comment on this? Have you encountered this scanner issue?
I could give you an example of two people who came to me in Berlin one day. They knocked on my door, and they had this device. It was a webcam attached to a computer. They came from Russia, and they had this really weird device, and it basically measured people with this webcam, and then they looked at the frequency with which the outer part of the body was jiggling around. And they made this claim from some very old physiology book that something like, if you jiggle fast, then you're likely to commit a crime, and then you're kind of nervous and so on. And I thought, this is a load of nonsense. And then they told me there's actually an operation in 2 airports in Russia. And I thought, this clearly shows that any kind of technology, also the technology that we're developing, needs some kind of clear standards. We need to, as a scientific community, develop standards when people can truly claim that they can perform a certain thought reading or thought decoding thing. Say, for example, whether they can really decode whether a person is lying or not, or whether they really know that someone is going to buy a car, or that they're racist, etc. And I think this is really important, because the current way in which this information is used in courts, and we actually had a long discussion about this recently as well with some lawyers from the US, is that you just show, for example, an abnormality, and there's no causal connection that you have to demonstrate there. It's kind of casts sufficient doubt. And I think this is very problematic. We have to show a clear way of linking this technology and really specifying the amount of information we can get out of this information, get out of these technical measurements.
Go ahead, Frank.
Regarding brain scanning, well, I do know that the U.S. military is interested in that and have information on that. So they're definitely interested in it. I don't think any systems currently works very well. One example system would be infrared measures. You know, are you flush under the skin because you're nervous? And the infrared camera would pick that up a little more. And I think what that remote technology and current fMRI research, when they try to study lie detection, both suffer from this fundamental flaw. We don't really know, we're not really reading out truth and lie states from the brain. That's not really what's being read out at this stage. Like we can read out the person seeing a face, or they're seeing this pattern of lines. What's being read out is the emotional arousal that goes with the lie, or the cognitive thought of, oh, where were you last night? The extra thoughts that the person's having to come up with the excuse. And so it's either the cognitive extra thought or the emotion, but not the lying per se. So if you're asked a question about, you know, did you do this, and you feel nervous because you didn't, but your friend did. Or if you're asked, did you do this, and you know that the person who's interrogating you strongly believes that you're likely to be guilty, whether you are or not. We don't know how that will affect the emotional sensors of your brain, or how you'll think and construe the question. So we really don't know when we read out brain activity that's correlated with lying, whether that's lying per se or something that goes along with it. And these remote technologies are tapping into the same nonverbal, non-conscious behaviors that are signs of nervousness, anxiousness, suspicious behavior But if you're a targeted group and you're racially profiled, if I'm, of Islamic descent and passing through security and of the right age, I might be nervous just because I look like a potential suspect.
In terms of lie detection, some of the lie detection technology, not the airport technology, does try to look at actual patterns in the brain and see if we can detect what's different about lies. But as Frank said, sometimes what we're detecting is if I say, how old are you? And you say, I'm 30, it's a one-step process. If you decide to lie, you think at some level very quickly, I'm 30, I'm going to lie about this, what should I pick? I'll pick 28. And then you say 28, and what a lot of these brain detection technologies may be seeing are those extra steps. And what that means, of course, is that you could train yourself perhaps not to take those extra steps. There are 2 companies now that are incorporated that are trying to offer some of these lie detection technologies to the public. But these technologies are still very early. There are only a handful of published papers on them. They're mostly tested on undergraduates and universities, like most of the things we know. We know about people from 18 to 21, and not on people with psychopathology, not on con men, not on pathological liars, not on a lot of the people that you would actually see out there. And so this is a perfect example of what John Dillon was saying. We need very, very strong standards in place about how these technologies are going to be used, because right now there are none. Anybody could set these kinds of companies up and use these technologies, and it is pretty frightening.
So John Donahue, are you like completely off the hook here ethically because you help paralyzed people?
To some extent, I can claim that, yes. No, but I think we do have to be considerate of that we have a particularly vulnerable population. And in terms of thinking about the ethics, it's very important to say, if a person is paralyzed, if I start making false claims about how much we can do, and I hope everyone recognized that I was very cautious about how early we are in developing these technologies, that being in a kind of position of power, would mislead people, and a person with more malicious intent could try to convince individuals to have these implants so they could learn more about their brain or do other things. So again, I think that there's a potential for misuse. We are, of course, under great control from regulatory bodies and hospitals that watch over these things. But I think, and as the scientists have a moral responsibility, ethical responsibility to make sure that the patients that will receive these devices will understand them. I think one other thing to get back to the other issue too, I just wanted to say that a lot of these, so far, a lot of these technologies are really probabilistic. That is, different people have different reactions. The P300 wave that we talked about, this brain wave that has a novelty response that is in the brain, I think there's 15
Hold on a second here. This was a conversation that these guys
No, they
weren't
heard
present at.
about this novelty response during the thing, but a P300 is a response in your brain to seeing something novel, and it just can be recorded on the outside of your head. And there's I think 15 or 20%. It's people are interested in it as a lie detector. That did you see it? Did you not? There should be a change in the response, and in some people it's quite robust. But in something like 15 or 20% of the people, it doesn't exist at all. You can't find it. And so I think it has what I call an airplane test. If 8 out of 10 times it works, is that okay? Well, would you get on a plane that 8 out of 10 times it would make it to its destination? I think that's not a valid test for me. So I think you can talk about the
But
use
let's talk
of that.
about John's work a little bit. We are, for the first time now, hardwiring the brain into computers. And one of the questions I asked John was, when he first started doing this, was that computer connected to the internet? Because if it was, for the first time in history, someone's brain became a node on the internet. And we can imagine if his subjects, as they can move that cursor around the screen, well, they can also click on Google and they can go into Facebook and they can begin to use their brain to interact as you use your computer to interact. And there are no particularly horrifying ethical implications of that, but it is the beginning, the first shot across the bow of an integration of information technology into our brains and with our brains. They are all, not John's work, but they're already looking at prosthetic hippocampal chips. These are chips that would be actually implanted in the brain. The hippocampus is the memory encoding part of the brain. And some people have lesions in their hippocampus, or their hippocampus is damaged, and that's why you get people who can't form long-term memories. There are movies about them, Memento, and what was that, 50 First Dates or something like that? Depending on which kind of movie you watch, the art movies or the popular movies. And they're actually now thinking about taking a chip, putting it in the brain so that information would go into the hippocampus, would get bypassed through the chip, bypassing the lesion or in the brain, and then put back into the hippocampus. Well, think about that for a second. Imagine that that technology works, and we now have the first person with that technology. We now have information technology, computer chips that are integrated into the very functioning of the brain. And that's not 1,000 years from now or 100 years from now. That is right around the corner. And we have to, we have a lot of...
But does that change our relationship with the internet?
Well, that's a great
I wonder
question.
whether or not that really raises an ethical issue. There's a lot here that seems to me to be somewhat similar to search and seizure. In other words, we have laws against people coming into our house if they don't have the right warrants.
Right.
I would assume that we would require the same warrants to have them rummaging through our brains.
We would, but here's my concern. I'm actually a radical on this issue. I believe that our skulls are absolute domains of privacy. That is, I don't believe that the state should be allowed to come in and get information from my brain even with that warrant. They can come into my house, they can search my house. I'm for an absolute right to cognitive privacy. And that means that under no circumstances should anyone be able to, should the court or the state or anyone else be able to mandate that the private content, what does a right to privacy mean if it doesn't mean the absolute right to the contents of my own thoughts?
What if somebody wishes to have their thoughts rifled through to be exonerated in the case that Frank was talking
If I
about?
voluntarily want this technology, I'm all for it. But you didn't ask the question that most people ask when I say that, which is, what about the terrorists with knowledge of the bomb in Manhattan? And that really is where the rubber hits the road about this. There will be times if...
We always have waterboarding.
But what if it can be done non-invasively?
Right. What if, exactly. What if you could do it without torture? You just have to stick them in an MRI machine and you could get some piece of information. And of course, that's where the real problem happens. Will we allow it in those circumstances? And if we'll only allow it in exceptional circumstances, how will we begin to define exceptional circumstances? And we've all seen over and over again the erosion of those limits when people begin to define all kinds of things as exceptional. So this is something as a society we're going to have to work out. But I really believe that it's going to all happen very soon, and that it's very important for everybody to think about where they would want those limits set, because this is going to be a conversation that as a society, our society and Germany and every other society is going to have to figure out where they're going to set the limits on these technologies.
Does anybody on this panel want to argue with Paul about his absolutism? Because that would be cool.
I actually don't want to argue with Paul on the importance of keeping what's in our heads private and of course, the notion of the right to silence. However, here's an interesting problem as technology advances. And we did point out the problems of using fMRI to detect lies. But let's say in the future it gets better and we do get to the source of the brain areas that are predictive of lying. And let's say the technology is so good, it's 99.99% accurate. You can, let's say, somehow they test it somehow and they confirm that that's true. Let's just take that as a thought experiment. This raises an interesting problem of people who then voluntarily consent to the test and those who do not. How would the people who voluntarily choose not to take the test be perceived by the courts? Or let's say if it's not even at the court level case, civil action cases or CEOs regarding, stock issues.
Well, people who
or
take the
like
fifth
that.
now risk, run the risk of arousing suspicion, but, tough luck. Right?
True, but with 99.99% accuracy, it weights the card quite a bit as to wondering why, why would they not take the test if we ever get to that point.
There was an interesting decision in which Clarence Thomas wrote a side comment, and it was about polygraphy and lie detection. And he wrote something interesting that he wrote, even if we were to have an effective lie detector, in his view, it would never be admissible in court because it usurps the job of the jury whose sole responsibility it is to determine the truth or lie of plaintiffs. So that's a really interesting, I mean, it wasn't the majority opinion, it was just a throwaway comment because we didn't have an accurate lie detector yet.
It is interesting, and you know, it's so interesting, and I don't want to digress from the main part of this conversation, but if we're talking about technology supplanting a traditionally human function,
Yeah, exactly.
we can talk about, you know, umpires and baseball and you know, instant replay.
Right.
I mean, the fact is, if the truth is out there, why do we stick with an antiquated system of trusting human beings?
So I think that
Great
so
question.
Paul was bringing up the idea of replacement parts for the brain. What if we had a full brain that was a replacement? That is, we could reproduce the whole thing. In fact, I think one thing that everyone is sort of missing is that all of these studies that we do is what's called neurophysiology. It's what we've been doing for about 100 years, trying to pick apart how the brain is actually working. And when you really understand how something works, you can replicate it. If you could replicate a human brain, it could be, if I could replicate your brain exactly, would it take the same position, or the same strong position, or would it take a different position? So, and we would argue about what it is about brains that make them slightly different, why twins aren't identical truly in the way they think and the way they behave. So I think, you know, there may be a breakthrough in understanding enough about how the brain works that we could make a full replacement part. It'll probably be the most revolutionary kind of event that occurs, because then you will be having full conversations with your internet computer, and it'll make decisions that you can argue about all day long.
But I have one caution about that. I mean, we're very cerebrocentric in modern science. We really believe the brain, if you took my brain and took John's out and put my brain in John's head, aside from that organism right there all of a sudden becoming less intelligent than it is right now.
I doubt it.
Most people would say that's Paul, not John. Presumably you would have my memories, my ideas, would think of my wife as its wife and my kids as its kids.
Face off.
Face off.
Face off, yeah.
But there's a problem with that, and that is we're all convinced, or most of us are convinced that that's true, but that is a very recent cultural and historically situated view of the brain. Throughout most of history, and also even today in other cultures, people don't think of the brain that way. In Japanese culture, for example, the site of personhood is thoracic. It's in the abdomen. It's not in the brain. And that's why you have such trouble with cadaveric transplant in Japan, because in Japanese culture, a body that's lying there where the heart is beating and blood is suffusing through the organs is not dead, even if it's what we call brain dead. So, and that's why when you commit seppuku, you disembowel yourself, you don't cut your head off, because that is where you kill yourself. That is where you destroy personhood. So the idea that we're all brain, our personality, and our thoughts and our memories, everything is only and uniquely in the brain, is something that we take for granted, but we may end up being surprised someday when we actually can replace brains, or when we understand the nervous system better, to discover that there's much more of a somatic part to who we are as people than right now neuroscience seems to suggest.
Do you encounter that at all, John? I mean, I know your entry point is the brain, but you know, we know that there are more neural endings in your stomach and in your alimentary canal than there is in your brain, and we know how sense memory affects the way that we not just feel about things, but how we think about things. Do you, in reattaching those connections, do you find links in surprising places?
Well,
Do you have any idea what I'm talking about?
Not really, no. But you did evoke a few thoughts. I think that, so just to say one thing is that one thing that surprised me is we think of the cerebral cortex as one of the crowning glories of specialized brains, all the thoughts going on up there. And when Matthew in particular, and we sat with him, and he was controlling the cursor on a screen, so he's sitting there thinking what's coming out is being translated, he's controlling the cursor. If you asked him, first of all, you know, what's going on in your head? Well, each day he'd have a different story. He would make up stories about how his brain was working, just like, I think, if you asked a little kid, you know, when you pick up the toothbrush in the morning and brush your teeth, how does your brain make your hand do that? They would just make up some story. So it was interesting to us that he had no insight into what that part of his brain was actually doing. It's sort of functioning, but it's very active. He has no feedback. So I think the brain is actually operating and performing all kinds of actions. And even at the level, this highest level where consciousness is supposed to be taking place, the things are going on and you have no idea of what's actually happening there.
Is it true we only use 10% of our brains?
Completely wrong, and nobody knows where it came from. But a good game is to ask all your friends where they got, what their number is, and have them write it on a piece of paper, because it goes from, I think, 2 or 3% up to 50% or something like that. But I think the experience now is that the brain is a pretty active place. We're doing a lot all the time, and the fMRI data, I think, will help support that. And certainly the direct recordings we do supports it.
Do you guys think that do you see a limit? Is there a limit to what we can know about the brain? And as you look forward, what is the ultimate goal in your research, even if you don't live to see it in 200 years? I mean, do you think that ultimately we'll be able to map the brain and read the messages very clearly, very granularly? That we'll be able to know everything about how a person feels at a given moment from how their brain lights up?
Well, I think the big difficulty that nobody at the moment has really got a good idea how to address it is how to understand, and I'll use the language of the brain. So most techniques that are used are brute force techniques. You find this pattern of brain activity, this thought, and you find this spike pattern. The person is thinking of a leftward movement, this spike pattern, the person is thinking of a rightward movement. But I mean, what we really need to do in order to read out all the possible thoughts a person has is we need to understand the syntax and semantics, not just of the person's thoughts, but also in their brain. And I don't think at the moment we have very good ideas. For example, language has a feature that is called compositionality. Dog bites man. Just take a very simple sentence. Now, that involves a thought about a dog as an actor in a scene. It involves an action, biting, and involves an object that suffers from this is man. So the meaning is composed out of kind of elements of meaning that you can also reuse in different sentences. For example, you can go, dog goes for a walk, or something like that. Something, man bites hamburger. So all these elements can be reused in different components, and as components in different meanings. And I think this is actually this aspect of compositionality of meaning. This is something that I don't think neuroscience has a clear idea to this at the moment. It's not even clear how you would go about looking at this.
Couldn't we take our cues from computer languages?
Yeah, but computer language is different because they're fundamentally symbolic. So you have a symbol, and the symbol gets meaning by, well, definition and by certain rules with which it's processed. But in the brain, we don't know what these rules are, and we don't have symbols, but we have activation patterns, like half the brain or the whole brain involved in a specific mental process.
So do you think the language of the brain will always prove elusive, or will we crack that code?
I'm not saying we couldn't crack it, but I think at the moment we don't even have an idea how to do that.
But think of the magnitude of the problem. There's something like 10 to the 10th neurons in your brain. As Frank said, that's a really big number. Each one of those neurons has about 10,000 contacts called synapses on them. And each one of those tickles a little bit the neuron, and how, when a couple of hundred or 1,000 or so all cooperate together, they make that neuron as another independent little brain active, and it interacts with some other neuron. And so really to understand what the brain was doing, you'd have to look at how all of those interactions were occurring. So you think of 10 to the 10th times 10 to the 5th is so many interactions that it's unfathomable to me that we'll ever look at. We'll know how a brain works, but we'll never know how your brain works.
I thought that we had mapped sections of the brain already. Am I wrong about that?
No, we know a lot about parcellation. So as I showed you, we know where to go to pick up the signals about the arm. But in fact, when you move
just don't know what else is going on in there, in that section?
There's a lot of other things going on. In fact, the more we look, as I showed you, the monkey's arm reaching out in space and our ability to get all this information about the whole arm, the sort of traditional view was that little piece of the brain that we're studying is only interested in what your wrist does and doesn't know anything about the rest of the body. That's just absolutely not true. What that movie shows is that that piece of the brain has a big conversation going on with how do you want to put your arm out in space. And we don't know how it really thinks about it. It's got some complex language. And mixed up in that is some kind of noise going on, and there's even an argument, is all that unpredictable stuff a kind of noise, or is it really the brain communicating? And we don't know.
So, I guess to conclude this session, we have such an amazing prospect before us for healing and for, if we can download our brains, something close to immortality. And we also have the opportunity for the ultimate invasion of privacy. So, what would each of you want the people here to take away from this session? Paul, you start.
Small question there.
Yeah, that's a very big question. We need to understand the nature of the work that's going on. When I talk to audiences about what's going on in neuroscience, and I go across, there are a lot of other very interesting things going on that we haven't had time to deal with here. And I try to show them the overall picture of our ability to begin to predict what people are thinking or behaving, or their traits or states or abilities and things. It's really quite profound that we've done this in such a short time. Because fMRI, for example, hasn't been around very long, and yet in that short time, we've really discovered a lot about the brain. So my major message to people is, we're going to have to make a lot of decisions. We haven't really put a lot of attention on this. There's a tiny fraction of the attention that has been paid, for example, to ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics, with which we spent millions and millions of dollars to look at that. We spent a fraction of that to look at the ethical, legal, and social implications of neuroscience, and yet what's happening in neuroscience is much more immediate and in some ways more powerful than what is happening right now in genetics. Maybe 30, 40 years from now that won't still be true, but it is certainly true. Our ability to manipulate the brain in human beings, for example, is much more powerful than our ability to manipulate human genetics, for example. And yet, we're not really paying it the attention it deserves. So my takeaway message is, we have to be vigilant as a society as these things begin to happen, and make sure that we're thinking very clearly about where we want to set boundaries, and by the way, who gets to set those boundaries? Is it the court? Are we going to, I have 2 teenage daughters, and I come home one day and the car is dented, and both of them say they didn't do it. Do I get to haul them off to No-Lie MRI and
Which is real.
put them in a brain scanner, which is a real company? So these are questions that you want to get a job at the bank, and they say, I'm sorry, before you can be a teller, we have to brain scan you. Are these going to be things that we are, as a society, are going to allow? Or are we going to restrict it to, Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib? Is that where we're going to allow these kinds of technologies to take place? These are decisions that we are going to have to make fairly soon. And they're going to be very complicated, and there are going to be a lot of subtle aspects to them. And I would like people to think about these things, to pay attention in the media when these things show up, and also an appeal that we need to be more vigilant about studying them, and more resources have to be put into understanding the implications of these technologies.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I think one of the keys to follow up on Paul's and to follow up on all of these ideas is science education. I think that it's really critical that people come to understand what science has done, what they're capable of doing, as we're trying to do here. But I think the fear, trepidation of where science is going to take us comes from a lack of understanding. One of the things that has really shocked me in presenting data about our trial is when I talk about how an age of neurotechnology is already here, and you say, okay, how many people have had an electrode stuck into their brain to treat the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, because you can stimulate the brain and get rid of the shaking and tremor and rigidity of Parkinson's. And even with well-informed audiences who are maybe biologists but not physicians, numbers come up like 10 or 20 people have had this voluntarily done. The answer is it's closer to 50,000 have done it. So there are huge numbers of people who have already, this is a field that's already here. So I think you should understand that. You should understand what good it does and what the implications are. But this is really a mission of scientists communicating to the public, and also the public's responsibility to understand where we are as a field.
Mm-hmm.
What I find so interesting about neuroscience, and I think we will make progress in understanding the code of the brain. We'll have a better idea of how brain states map onto mental states. The really hard problem is, how does it work and how does the brain function? That will be many, many decades of work. But I think there will be major advances on being able to read out mental states from brain states. And for me, what's interesting and intriguing about it is that as as we get closer, I'm one of my most frequent fMRI subjects. I scan my own brain, I look at my brain, and I know what I was thinking at the time when I did the experiment. And then I look at my brain and say, oh, that's what I was thinking over there. I feel like I'm closer to understanding what my conscious experiences are, how I think, feel, see the world, what it means to imagine something. And I think that neuroscientists will provide a perspective complementary to art in sort of understanding our own conscious experiences, a sort of complementary symphony to what's been done on the art side. We will have new perspectives on what it means to be human. And one aspect I think is very interesting is that there's not just one me or one brain. What we will discover as we study the brain is that there are many me's, many mini-me's, you could say. And so the case of the police officer and the scanning the amygdala is an interesting example. Let's say if you scan my brain, I don't have a boss because I'm a professor, but let's say if you scan my brain and it said, oh, I hate my boss. And if you ask the question, would you like to kill your boss? Maybe that brain scan would say yes. There's a visceral part of me that would actually enjoy seeing the act of my boss die. But there might be a cognitive part of me that would never, ever do that. So there are many me's to the brain and many states. And I think what we'll discover as we study brain states more and more is that the brain's incredibly complex. It's like a competition between many areas trying to decide what we do. And I look forward to seeing how we learn about that.
Well, I'd say that I think neuroscience is in a transition phase at the moment. I mean, myself only been in neuroscience for 10 years, but I mean, I can observe a transition where neuroscientists are beginning to realize that what their research is kind of yielding is also has technical applications. And I think this is something that the field, not just the public has to realize, but also the field itself has to realize. People have to realize that if I do research on, for example, neurocorrelates of racial prejudice, this might also be used for some kind of application for like a racial bias detector or something. So I think it also needs a wider acceptance in the neuroscience community to think about
that
the
your work has
applications.
Consequences.
Well, on an ethical sense, yes, but also to think what kind of practical things can we do with our research? You know, I mean, a lot of the time people are locked away in an ivory tower, and to do anything related to applications is considered dirty, it's impure. I think that's something the field might want to realize, that there's a huge potential buried there as well. On the other hand, I'd like to point out as to the risks of this technology, I'd like to point out that so far as I know, the US is the only country in the world that has actually previously legislation related to the use of thought decoding technology, and that is the so-called Employee Polygraphy Protection Act. And this is, of course, not a brain scanner, but it's related to a polygraph, so a very old lie detector that uses arousal to measure when you're lying. And we, of course, know that it doesn't work that well, but still, it shows that there has been the need to regulate the use of this technology, because I think in the 1970s, when this was passed, early 1980s, companies were trying to use this technology on employees to, for example, find out if they really had a loyal disposition to the company, say in a job interview, or you might want to use it if something was stolen. You might subject all your staff to a lie detector, and it was considered important then to pass legislation that regulates these cases. And now you're not allowed to use a polygraph unless you're a government contractor, I think FBI and things like that. So then you can. And I think it just shows that if you can isolate a specific case that as a society you don't want to use, then you can pass legislation that can be quite efficient.
All right. John Dylan Haynes, thank you very much. Frank Tong, John Donahue, Paul Root Wolpe, thank you very much, and thank you for being here.